Welcome to the Fall 2022 China's Global Power Database webinar, hosted by the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. The Boston University Global Development Policy Center is a university-wide research center that works to advance policy-oriented research for financial stability, human well-being, and environmental sustainability across the globe. My name is Oyi Tarella Do Moses, or Tarella, and I am the data analyst and database manager for the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. China has financed electric power plants around the world for several decades. The country's involvement in the global power sector is of growing importance in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative and continued attention to the social, environmental, and economic impacts of China's overseas economic activity. To better understand this phenomenon, the Boston University Global Development Policy Center has created, maintained, and updated the China's Global Power Database. First launched in 2020, the CGP Database tracks power plants outside of China financed through Chinese foreign direct investment and loans from China's two policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. What is the status of China's global power plants? In how many countries are they operating? And what are the dominant energy sources? What are the implications of the data for implementation of Chinese leader Xi Jinping's 2021 announcement to stop building new coal-fired power plants overseas and instead ramp up renewable energy support to developing countries? Today's webinar discussion will summarize the 2022 update to the CGP database released on Tuesday, capturing the state of Chinese finance overseas power plants by tracking various physical and financial characteristics of the plants and estimating their CO2 emissions. Our panel today includes 3 researchers who developed the database update and the corresponding policy brief, as well as 2 external experts who will provide commentary and reactions on the findings. They are Cecilia Springer, the Assistant Director of the Global China Initiative at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, Yang-Siyu Liu, a Global China Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, Huake Kate Chi, a research assistant at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center and a master's student in the Department of Economics at Boston University, Li Huan Zhou, an associate with World Resources Institute's Sustainable Finance Center, where he mainly works on the Sustainable Investing Initiative and conducts research to advance sustainable investment practices in the private sector, and Shizhou Zhou, a vice president in the Climate and Sustainability Group at S&P Global Commodity Insights, where he leads the company's power and renewables practice globally. The 3 researchers will present findings for 10 minutes, followed by expert remarks. After that, we will have a panelist discussion session, followed by a 20-minute Q&A discussion session. Before turning it over to our speakers, I want to mention that this webinar is being live streamed on YouTube, so a recording will be immediately accessible. Please use the Q&A box located in your Zoom menu to ask your questions. Please also give your name and affiliation, and please feel free to enter your questions at any time during the discussion. Thank you, and now over to you, Cecilia, Yang-Siyu, and Kate.
Thank you, Tarella. We're really excited to be here today and share the results of an update process that we've been working on for the past several months. Can everybody see my screen okay? Great. So the China's Global Power Database was first launched in 2020, and the data that we released just this week is our first update of this database. And let me just introduce what we found in the snapshot that we've taken of China's overseas power plants around the world. So China's policy banks and companies have financed 171.6 gigawatts of electric power generating capacity in 92 countries around the world. This spans over 1,400 power generating units that represent 648 individual power plants. So this is the snapshot that we've taken. And let me clarify again the scope that Tarela mentioned when she introduced the database. So we cover overseas power plants, plants outside of China that have been financed through foreign direct investment from Chinese companies and or finance loan commitments from China's two global policy banks, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. And the way that we gather this data, to sum it up briefly, is that the data from the China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank of China draw from our GDP Center databases, which combine an algorithmic web scraping approach to identify projects around the world combined with manual verification. To identify plants receiving Chinese foreign direct investment, we've identified companies, Chinese companies that provide investment for power plants around the world. And then we've matched them to a database of power plants and then manually verified their financing information. So through these two slightly different approaches, we create a data set of power plants around the world. Some of them are co-financed by both the policy banks and the foreign direct investment. And all of that information is in our downloadable data set. I do want to highlight a few updates that we made to the methodology this year. First is we went previously from the power plant level. Now we've disaggregated to the power generating unit level, which is slightly more detailed. And the reason that that is important is because some larger power plants have multiple power generating units, which may have been built at different points in time and financed by different entities. So this way we can really capture where China has provided finance for power generation around the world. There are some other details that we can get into in the Q&A. But I just want to highlight some of our top line findings from this year's update and our global snapshot. So first is that Asia has received the most Chinese loans and investment in power generation capacity. We're looking at about 90 gigawatts, or a little more than half of the total capacity tracked in our data set. In terms of energy sources, coal represents the greatest share of capacity tracked in our data set at a little bit over 1/3. It's also really important to note that all of the fossil fuel power plants in our data set, their median year of commission is 2016, which means that half of these plants are only 6 years into their lifetime or less, and these plants can operate for decades, meaning that we need to take a close look at their carbon dioxide emissions impacts. To that end, the CGP database does estimate unit level CO2 emissions, and we find that currently operating plants in the database emit roughly as much carbon dioxide per year as the energy-related emissions from the countries of Spain or Thailand. So these are our top line findings, and I'm going to turn it over to Kate to discuss some of the capacity-based findings.
Thank you, Cecilia. Now we discuss some of the updated patterns we identify in these Chinese financed overseas power plants into two folds: capacity patterns and the patterns of carbon emissions. Next slide, please. First, we look at the distribution of energy sources and assess by capacity and by the number of units here. We identify coal with the greatest share at 34% of the capacity of all Chinese overseas power units with investment and loans. The next largest energy sources are hydropower at 29% in capacity, gas at 18%, solar and wind projects combined at 12% in generating capacity. At the unit level, the number of coal-fired power generating units account for 10% of total units, while wind and solar here account for 26%. This is not surprising because renewable energy projects typically have much smaller capacity than coal projects. Next slide, please. Now, we use a similar scope. We look at the portfolio of Chinese financed overseas power capacity by status. In our CGP database, we break it down into three statuses, which are in operation, under construction, and under planning. We identify that fossil fuel projects, particularly coal and gas, account for more than half of the operational capacity. And because a number of projects tracked in our database are currently under construction, this trend is expected to continue. However, the majority of projects that are under planning are low carbon energy sources, including 11 gigawatts of hydropower and 5 gigawatts of solar and wind power. Next slide, please. Now, from the lens of deal type, we break it down into 4. Policy bank is shown in the red color here. The blue shades report FDI, including greenfield investment and merger and acquisition projects. The combination of FDI and policy bank here is shown in black. When we look at the energy sources of these overseas power plants, we see that Chinese policy banks represented in the red color contributed to large coal and hydropower generating capacity. Additionally, FDI accounts for the vast majority of Chinese overseas investment in gas-fired power plants and solar and wind projects. Next slide, please. Lastly, in our capacity assessment, we look at the regional distribution and identify stark differences in energy sources across region. Asia receives the most loans and investment in power generating capacity at 90 gigawatts, followed by the Americas at 34 gigawatts, and Africa at around 25. Asia has a high concentration of fossil fuel-based power generating capacity, particularly coal-fired projects. And the majority of hydropower is distributed in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Solar and wind projects span across the globe, with the Americas being the largest recipient region at about 7 gigawatts. Chinese investment in Europe and Oceania is largely concentrated in natural gas, nuclear, and other non-hydro renewable projects. Now I'm turning to Yang Ziyu to present our carbon emissions trends.
Thanks, Kate. So I'll continue with our analysis on carbon dioxide emissions. In order to estimate the annual CO2 emissions from overseas Chinese financed power plants, we apply region-specific emission factor and fuel-specific capacity factor to each power unit based on where it is located and what kind of fuel it used. So here we present the estimated annual CO2 emissions from power units that are currently in operation, as well as under construction and planning. We see the operational units are currently emitting about 245 million tons of CO2 per year. And if units that are under construction and planning come online eventually, they will add another 100 million tons of CO2 to the annual emissions. Next slide, please. Then we also break down by country, and we see here Brazil as the recipient country that has the most Chinese financed generating capacity, followed by Pakistan and Indonesia. We also note that although Brazil ranked the first in terms of capacity, yet its associated annual CO2 emissions are quite low. And this is because Chinese investments in Brazil are mostly in low carbon energy sources, such as hydropower and wind power. And we also see that among the 92 countries that have received Chinese financed generation, the top 10 countries represent over 2/3 of the total capacity and produce about 82% of the total CO2 emissions. So we see these CO2 emitting fossil fuel units are quite concentrated in these top 10 countries. Next slide, please. We also take a further look at Chinese companies that have provided foreign direct investments for overseas power generation. And we see that the top 10 companies are all state-owned enterprises. They have contributed to about 76% of the total FDI-supported generation capacity and produce a similar percentage of CO2 emissions. It's also worth mentioning that in addition to these state-owned enterprises, there are also a number of smaller private companies that are actively investing in overseas power generation. And many of them are exclusively investing in renewable energies. Next slide, please. So Based on these analyses, I would like to offer some recommendations from our team here. So in the next slide, we recommend that firstly, Asia should be an area of focus for decarbonization, as it is the region that has received the most generation capacity, and more than 50% of it is coal-based. And secondly, cancellation of future coal plants and retirement of existing ones may be one of the solutions to decarbonize the current investments and also avoid significant carbon dioxide emissions in the future. And we also recommend that further research is needed in order to understand how China's policy banks and companies, especially state-owned enterprises, could change their portfolios in order to meet China's no-coal announcement and other BRI guidelines. So that's all from our data team here, and I'll pass it back to Tarila for the panel discussions.
Well, thank you, research team. I will now pass it to Li Huan to share some remarks with us.
Thanks, Tarila. First, congratulations to the BU team, particularly Cecilia Springer, Yang Siyu, and Kate, for your excellent work to update the database and to produce the policy brief. My name is Li Huan Zhou. I'm an associate working at the Water Resources Institute, and my work at WI across the China's overseas investments and also the private sector investing initiative here. And I want to also introduce one of the databases that BU GDP, the Inter-American Dialogue, and the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins, together with WI, that we co-developed as the China Overseas Finance Inventory Database. That one focuses on the financial flows, and it includes investments by commercial banks as well. But it does not produce new data. It relies on the excellent work that done by our colleagues at the BU GDP Center. And we also purchased some of the commercial databases. I think part of the effort we've negotiated is that we are allowed to make all the commercial databases that we purchased as part of the COFI open to the public. And the database is available to download from BU GDP Center website and WI website. And for today's comment, I want to share some of the common challenges that we've encountered in developing those databases and also some of the policy implications. I think first is that we acknowledge there is lack of transparency and disclosure from official channels to understand the scale of overseas investments, including the power sector. And no matter whether it's by Chinese financial institutions or by corporates. As the previous panelists have discussed, the CGP database includes FDI statistics, FDI investments, and also investments by the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. So the Chinese government indeed publish FDI statistics annually, but it's aggregated at such an industry level that combines all utility sector as a single number, and that includes water, gas, and electricity supply. So from the official numbers, it's impossible to know the power generation investments, even at the global level, from China to all other countries. And this might be a common issue in FDI statistics, not just China. For example, in the United States, is also aggregated at the utility level, but they do break down to some other countries. And some countries do a better job in disclosing the information. For example, the Indian government, they disclose transaction level data for outward investments. So it's more transparent and in terms of the data granularity. I think for loan, it's even worse because there's no sectoral loan data published from the government. We've seen that the only disclosures by the China Development Bank and Exim Bank is from their annual reports and sometimes sporadic web page and news announcements. And I think in recent years, we've seen that the transparency of these two financial institutions has getting a little bit worse. For example, the China Development Bank stopped disclosing overseas outstanding loan balances after their 2018 annual reports. So in order to understand China's overseas investments, we have to rely on other sources to come up with a comprehensive picture, like our colleagues did at the BU GDP Center. They have come up with a very robust framework to gather information and to validate the information. But here, I think we can only get very close to the full picture, but never the full picture itself, because we lack of the official source to corroborate our findings. And aside from the tracking investments, we also hope our work can drive greater transparency and disclosure from the Chinese government and the financial institutions, because they are the ultimate holders of the information. And in terms of the policy implications, I think we have seen similar findings in papers in the past few years. And that finding is that private Chinese companies have cleaner investments than state-owned companies, whether it's financial institutions or non-financial corporates. And as early, I think back in 2018, working paper that we collaborated with Professor Gallagher, and we found that private companies usually have modest internal financial resources than state-owned enterprises in China. And for them, in the China context, it's harder for them to obtain bank loans, and especially for cross-border ones. And in comparison, solar PV and wind, those renewable energy projects typically are significantly smaller in financial terms than fossil fuel and hydropower projects. So it's more like a natural fit for private companies in China to invest in these two particular renewable energy projects. For SOEs, they have pretty complex corporate structure and also decision-making process. So these can result in very high transaction cost for cross-border investments. So for them, in order to cover a very big transaction cost, they would typically invest in larger projects to cover that. And that results in more investments, as we've seen in coal, in hydro, for example. There are also indeed smaller power projects owned by SOEs. And I speculate those would tend to be from merger and acquisition transactions, because one transaction typically can include several power plants so that they can cover the high transaction cost. And I strongly agree with the future policy research to how to shift portfolios and investments from Chinese financial institutions and SOEs to greater renewable energy projects. And maybe this would also need to include financial innovations to how to package smaller projects together, and particularly for greenfield projects. Thanks, and I'll turn over to Daria.
Thank you, Li Huan. And now I will turn it over to Xizhou for his remarks.
Thanks everybody for the opportunity to join this great webinar, and also to see this great database that we in S&P Global. I was previously with IHS Markit. We've come together as one big company now. A lot of the work we do involve tracking power plants around the world, tracking transmission, tracking engineering work, and we understand how much work goes into this effort, especially if you don't have a huge team based around the world. And so this kind of work is very important, and we need different entities to do this, oftentimes to also help check the accuracy and keep everything updated. And we also understand that the hardest part of this is how to keep it day in and day out, and make sure that it's still in an updated picture. So thanks for the team for the great work. A few observations. September travel opened up a little bit. I traveled to Asia for the first time in 2 years. specifically was in Thailand and Singapore. And as the data have shown here, right, a lot of the Chinese outbound investment in the power sector are in this region. And we are also in some unprecedented times in the global energy business with elevated coal and gas prices that are impacting everybody. So a few things I saw during the travel was that there's much more concern now about energy security around the world. And we're starting to see a trend where coal and gas prices are so high that any molecule that Europe could find, they're buying it up just to keep everything going. That many developing countries can no longer afford basic fuels. And in a way, that actually has helped shift generation to the cleaner side a little bit. And what we found out, I think for folks really concerned about the climate side, is a pretty optimistic picture whereby global emissions have actually declined during the first 6 months of the year because of that high fuel prices. I'll just show a quick chart here. This is first 6 months generation numbers from the previous year. And what you see here is that for coal and gas generation, we've seen declines pretty much everywhere. The only place that we see an increase is Europe has a little bit of coal-fired generation increase. The US has some gas-fired generation increase, and the rest of the world have all seen coal-fired generation go down. There are many reasons behind it, for example, the Chinese economy and COVID lockdowns. But overall, we're seeing these high coal and gas prices actually contributing to a decline in the generation. And that's not surprising. When things are expensive, people consume less of it. And that brings me back to a point about basic power system tracking. This is important for us. What we are charged to do in S&P Global is how you balance supply with demand. And we are in a situation where we're seeing in many markets, people are not generating power anymore. We've seen this in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, just because the people cannot afford the fuel. So there's now reported power outages in some of these markets. And that's a very important message in terms of, I think when we think about power plants themselves and the fuel markets. What's shown here is really that oftentimes power plants are built but not run. And that has many different reasons behind it. It could be fuel prices too high, like current situation. It could also be that we have a lot more renewables being built and you run your thermal baseload capacity less. We've already seen that in a number of countries. So that leaves a question of stranded assets that many have discussed for thermal units. So that's one area that I think it's important to highlight. The other thing is that in Southeast Asia and South Asia as well, currently we don't have the kind of technology in battery storage at scale to really meet current demand growth. And many countries have essentially turned from coal to natural gas as sort of the transition fuel, right, to use as dispatchable baseload generation. Now, the current crisis and record gas prices, we're seeing gas prices increasing tenfold in some markets, has essentially prevented many of these new gas plants being built. So there's a question in many of these countries now with basic demand growth. How do you meet that? And oftentimes that new demand is people buying their first refrigerator or first air conditioning unit. So it's what we call baseload growth that you have to support 24/7. And if you don't have coal, you don't have natural gas, you're not left with a lot of options currently. And so there's a question of what technologies can be made available for many of these countries, especially if you don't have hydro reservoir either. That becomes a very challenging picture when we think about basic supply demand matching. And then the third issue, and my final point, is really about transmission. We on the power business, we focus a lot on generation assets, but with the record growth of renewables, we have, as the researchers here have mentioned, I think Kate mentioned this in the tracking renewable projects, the number is just bigger because each unit has much smaller capacity. So you need a lot more transmission interconnection to get everything connected to the grid. So the scale of transmission is also required. We already seen that here in the United States. Interconnection queues are very long, it's very hard to get through them. In countries like Vietnam, that's become a very big challenge. In your database, you track, for example, the past couple of years, record number of solar PV projects financed by Chinese companies and built by Chinese companies in Vietnam. The latest I heard there was that there is a very high curtailment rates now for these solar facilities because transmission system is not ready for it. So that's something I think we can also focus a little bit on in terms of future efforts. How do you build the basic infrastructure for the power system to make sure that the generation side of things are connected and we don't end up in a situation where we have in countries like Vietnam, we ended up having to curtail renewables that have been. So those are a few observations. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Shizhou, and both to you and Li Huan. Your thoughts were very insightful. So now I just want to enter into the panelist discussion. And as I ask some questions, I just encourage those who are watching to enter your questions into the Q&A box. Before we go to audience questions, I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper into two things that both Li Huan and Shizhou mentioned. Li Huan, you mentioned some financial innovations are needed for future financing of projects that provide power. And I'm curious to know what are some examples of those financial innovations and what are some policy practices or directions that host countries and China itself can take to prepare those financial innovations. And Shizhou, if you have any insights into that too, that would be great. And then lastly, I know both of you mentioned different sources of data that bring more insight into what the research team has showed us today. But I'm just curious if there are any other sources of data that might shed light on different actors that may be involved in China's financing for projects, power projects overseas, or just other insights that we might not have covered today from other sources of data.
Tarila, thanks. I think those two are very interesting questions. And I think for financial innovations, I can think about, I think, at least 2 points. First is de-risking. I think at the WI, we have colleagues working with public financial institutions. And one of the areas that we are seeing with increased interest is how to mobilize greater private and commercial money into renewable energy investments, particularly in developing countries. And as the database shows that, there's lots of investments by Chinese corporates and also by the China Development Bank. And I think a lot of those investments are, commercial based. They're trying to earn a reasonable return. And I think one of the challenges investing in other developing countries is there is sometimes bigger, risks, like political risks or foreign exchange risks than invest in developed countries. So how, we can have certain policy arrangement and financial instruments to help de-risk those investments. I think it will be important to scale up those kinds of investments. And one particular example that I think I want to share is that lots of traditional donor countries, like the European governments and the US governments, they sometimes have poured resources to multilateral development banks and to support guarantees and insurance products for projects that those banks are investing in developing countries. And at the same time, I think China has also, in recent years, established its own foreign aid agencies. So I think there's potentially some room for the Chinese governments to learn from their counterparts in terms of how to mobilize Chinese foreign aid money to greater support renewable energy developments overseas. The second point, I think, on financial innovation, I think is around how we can package different projects together. We have seen some examples in developed countries, but I think still it's a little bit challenging to do that, particularly for greenfield investments. It's a lot like mortgages, that you can pool different mortgages together and make it as mortgage-backed securities, because mortgages, particularly in one country, it's pretty standardized. But investing in renewable energies, even in one country, the contracts can be different, and the consistency can be relatively low. So how we can, I think, pool greater resources, I think that would be great. And in terms of your second question about the data sources, I think I think it's an important question, but I think we can only get as much data from the public source and commercial databases as we've done for the COFI. We've included, I believe, more than 9 databases in COFI, so that we can come up with a comprehensive picture. And that includes publicly available data and the commercial data that we purchased, like Azure Global. Obviously, there's always, greater alternative resources out there. But for example, whether we can use satellite imagery or other potential techniques to gather greater, for example, capacity or utility, like or capacity factor, those kinds of information. But yeah, I think the potential is out there, but I think we have already done and included some of the major ones.
Maybe I'll add a little bit on the data collection side, right? This is it's a huge effort to do this in a updated and absolutely correct manner, and especially when it involves many different languages. And so once you get into Southeast Asia, pretty much every country has its own language. And to be able to talk to the key developers and utilities, that's been an important avenue for us to track some of the development and, which plans have been canceled, new ones that are in discussion. So for us, we do have the luxury of having teams on the ground that could do some of that along with other power market research. And data scraping has been a very important part of the tool that would utilize using data science. But oftentimes you end up having to do some on the ground work to talk to your connections, talking to people that you know in the industry. So that's helped us in some way, as many of the developers and utilities or EPCs are customers of ours. And we'd be happy to share some of our findings from time to time in the open sphere as well. The other thing about financing, I would add, is that the local government regulatory structure is very important. Ultimately, financial institutions still have to make a return on the investment. So the Southeast Asian countries oftentimes have what they call a power development plan that they issue. That plans out 5 years, 10 years, and that's being used as a guidance for many companies when they decide if a piece of investment will receive a lot of government support. The challenge now is that because of a lot of the changes in the global energy markets, these plans are being delayed or they're being revised in a very significant way. So, for example, what I heard latest from the Philippines is that because they couldn't get the natural gas contract signed to import LNG, there's pressure now to reconsider permitting new coal plants again on the government, even though they had signed a promise during the last COP to not permit any new coal plants. So this kinds of situations still come up, and it's important to understand what some of the local policy drivers are in many of these markets, and that will impact investors' confidence in what can be done in each market and how tariffs and terms can be designed.
Thank you both. I think you both highlighted some of the kind of processes and challenges that can come with putting together public information to prepare these databases. And I think it was very helpful to hear about financial innovations, different instruments that could be used, and the concerns of political risk as well. So we'll jump now into the Q&A. And I have a few questions here lined up, and I just encourage participants to keep putting questions in. So we'll start with a question from Alok for the research team. And they say, how many of these coal-fired power plants are in BRI countries? And do these investments defy China's announcement to end financing to these new coal power units? Then I'll also pose a question from Brent. He says, there was mention of CO2 emissions from hydroelectric dams. Is the database considering the very significant emissions of methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas, especially in the tropics? Also, how does the database consider CO2 emissions from deforestation linked directly or indirectly to hydroelectric dams and transmission lines? So we'll start with those two, and then, or three really, and then we'll come back.
Great. Yeah, first, I want to note that it's really difficult to define Belt and Road Initiative and specific countries. So in our other database, the China's Global Energy Finance Database, we distinguish countries that have signed memorandums of understanding with China on the Belt and Road Initiative. But I think there is some amount of squishiness in defining what is and isn't a BRI country. I do want to highlight that a lot of the coal plants in our data set are concentrated in countries that are very strategic for the BRI and work very closely with China in terms of the development goals of the BRI. For example, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Vietnam are in the top 5 destination for coal plants in our data set. Pakistan has the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor with China, and Vietnam and Indonesia are also major destinations for foreign direct investment and policy bank finance. And there is a concentration of Chinese financed coal power plants in those countries, and they are BRI countries. Regarding how this fits into last year's announcement from Xi Jinping that China would not build new coal plants overseas, I think you can see from our tracking of plants that are under construction and under planning that there, to some extent, still is a pipeline of coal-fired power plants. And I think there still remains some ambiguity as to which of these plants may continue forward and which should technically be canceled based on the parameters of the announcement that we understand so far. So I think that this is still playing out. I think there have been some other researchers have highlighted loopholes where there are captive power plants for industrial projects. They're not providing utility-based power generation, but more for individual smelting projects, for example. So there's still, a lot of clarity that still needs to happen for understanding the implications of Xi Jinping's announcement. Regarding the CO2 emissions in our data set, we only estimate direct emissions. But I think Brent raises a really good point that in tropical areas, many hydroelectric power plants do release other types of greenhouse gas emissions. We only estimate CO2. Because of the buildup of organic matter behind the dams. And you can also see from our data that there is a tremendous amount of foreign direct investment and policy bank finance for hydropower plants in Brazil, which has, tropical rainforest areas. So this is an important consideration. And then lastly, we also don't consider CO2 emissions from land use change. So actually cutting down forests to build these power plants, that can also be a significant source of emissions across energy types. So that is also a very important consideration that is not part of our emissions calculation, but I do want to highlight first our China's Overseas Development Finance Database, which is an additional database that Boston University compiles, does have the precise geolocation of projects receiving lending commitments from China's policy banks. And that geolocation data could be used for the kind of analysis that Brent is raising, looking at land use change. And we do have a previous study by my colleague, Rebecca Ray, development banks and the Andean Amazon, that looks at deforestation related emissions from development financed projects in the Andean Amazon. So there is research on this. It is just not in the purview of this particular database. And I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything to add to these questions.
One point I will make about the status of power plants is that once a project financing has closed, it's very hard to stop it, because there's a lot of money that's gone into site preparation, permitting, and everything, and your equipment may have already been ordered. So you've already, as a developer, you've signed an EPC contract. So a lot of legal work has been completed before that, and it's very hard to back out of those. And of course, it's even harder once construction has begun to cancel something. So our current working estimate assumption on some of the cancellations, that projects that have not reached financing close will likely be canceled. But as I mentioned, it also depends on the destination country sort of policy. Like I mentioned, the Philippines, if they really reach a point where they're going to start having power shortages, they may try to do a coal plant again. So those become very local issues that we have to delve into.
Thank you all. That was great. So we have a few more questions here. I have a question from Hong Zhang, and she's asking, she's interested in the breakdown of policy bank finance versus FDI plus policy bank and FDI only categories. She wonders if you're observing a trend for Chinese power companies to turn to equity investment as a way to engage in overseas power project development, given that Beijing has pulled back overseas lending in recent years. So could you elaborate on that a little bit more? And then we have another question from Candido for Shijo. And they ask, how important are technologies such as ultra high voltage or UHV, in which State Grid is a leading company, transmission lines in the context of the decentralization of the generation promoted by the growth of the renewables? And then we also have a question from Kevin Gallagher, the director of the Global Development Policy Center. And he mentioned that given the rising cost of capital in global markets, that renewables are becoming uncompetitive, or at least the costs of financing are increasingly out of reach for host governments. Given that China's policy banks are relatively 2 to 8%, given that China's policy banks,
I think he means cheaper. They're relatively cheaper.
Relatively cheaper, thank you. What kind of role might they be able to play to do credit enhancement to lower the cost of capital for renewable energy deployment? So I'll stop there and hear your thoughts.
Great. Yeah, I'll start with Hong Zhang's question. And I think it's extremely on point about observing a trend for Chinese power companies to turn to equity investment relative, for example, to the policy bank finance that we track in our data set. From our other databases that I mentioned previously, it's quite clear that China's overseas policy bank lending is decreasing in recent years. And as a result, the share of FDI, foreign direct investment, is also going up. I think this is really salient. We'll have our Global China Research Colloquium next month. In November, we'll cover China's overseas development investment funds, which we're identifying as an emerging channel for which China is channeling equity overseas besides foreign direct investment. So yes, the BRI is diversifying, and I'll encourage you to stay tuned for the findings of that forthcoming paper in our Global China Research Colloquium. And then I think the other questions, perhaps Shizhou and Li Huan will have some insights on.
Yeah, on the transmission side, that was the question, Tarella, that's the question, right? Yeah. So I think the question is really about there's maybe a disconnect between the large transmission projects that are needed and the decentralized nature of renewables. One thing I'll mention is that our global power system since the days of Edison has been designed as a grid where resources can be optimized. When demand rises in certain places, you could dispatch power to different places, and that helps increase the efficiency of your power plants and the resource itself. So even today, most of the solar investments in the world are utility scale. They're not what we think as rooftop projects. So there's still much need for these utility projects to be connected. And if I think about Vietnam, that's an example of it, and in most countries. And because of that, the transmission system still needs to be built out. Do we need ultra high voltage? Not necessarily, unless you want to go, 2,000 kilometers to send the power. If you are not a huge country like China or the United States, you probably can manage with regular high voltage lines that are 500 kV or below. And those technologies are not necessarily that sort of rocket science. They're things that most EPC companies and transmission operators know how to deal with. But the key is that one is the money needs to come, and two, the permitting needs to happen as well. So different countries face different challenges when it comes to transmission build out. Here in the US, it's a permitting issue. In some other countries, it's really about a investment issue, and then also the return on the assets as a natural monopoly asset. How do you regulate it? Keep the return rate at a reasonable level, and that investors will still come and put the money in.
Yeah, in terms of credit enhancement, I think beyond the two, the China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank of China, I think the Sinosure, the China Export Credit Insurance Corporation, also plays a very important role in terms of supporting China's overseas investments. Because Sinosure provides a suite of insurance products to cover potential losses for Chinese, whether investors like state-owned enterprises or financial institutions or equipment exporters. And in our research and conversation, we've learned that if a project can be insured by Sinosure, then it's very likely to be financed by Chinese SOEs or financial institutions, because the insurance and guarantees it provides is very significant to reduce the potential risks faced by those actors. So I think how we can, encourage Sinosure to provide greater support for renewable energies overseas, I think that would be also kind of important to scale up China's investments.
Thank you all. This was just a great panel where I know I learned a lot of information, so really appreciate your time. So this will be the end of our panel discussion. I want to thank Cecilia, Kate, Yang Yu, Li Huan, and Shizhou for sharing their thoughts with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined the discussion. Again, this webinar has been recorded and is on YouTube, and we will share the link in the chat. And to receive updates on our publications and events, you can subscribe to receive updates from our Global China Initiative. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.